Hello everyone, Spirit of Thersites here. Tonight I'm going to review and critique R.R. Reno's Return of the Strong Gods, Nationalism, Populism, and the Future of the West. Some people say that I don't take right-wing thinkers seriously enough, so tonight I'm going to do a fairly in-depth review of a book I read recently by a right-wing thinker. I've taken fairly extensive notes, so at times, if it sounds like I'm reading from a script, it's because, well, that's what's happening. A script I wrote. One which reads better silently than it reads aloud, unfortunately, so I'll have to make some adjustments as I go along. So let's begin by looking at Reno's argument itself. The argument of Return of the Strong Gods is that there was a post-war consensus from 1945 to the present which is focused almost exclusively on preventing the return of fascism, and all of the prominent thinkers from the period, from people as disparate as von Hayek to Michel Foucault, all fundamentally agree that banishing or diminishing the so-called strong gods is the best way to prevent the return of someone like Hitler. Strong gods, so far as I can tell, is a Reno term that he invented himself, and this means effectively things which inspire strong irrational loyalties, the kinds of things that men are willing to fight and die for, i.e. patriotism, religious belief, things of that nature. Reno says that the strategy of really trying to downplay the strong gods was understandable in the context of the immediate aftermath of World War II, and that for intellectuals to live through it, it would make sense that they would have a strong negative reaction and look for ways to prevent that from ever happening again. However, Reno thinks both that the obsession with banishing the strong gods has continued for too long, since he thinks that at this point fascism is no longer a major or meaningful threat, but also that because this denial of the strong gods has gone on for too long and has become too prominent, that it is this very denial which has led to our current political atmosphere, where we see populists such as Donald Trump and Viktor Orban gaining power. We see people trying to reject the managerial state and grab on to something more visceral. And he thinks that this is because people no longer have the firm moral foundation that the strong gods give people. He says that we need to welcome back the strong gods to rebuild our community solidarity, but we need to pick and choose these strong gods carefully so that things don't get out of whack as they did in the 1930s. He seems to think that the strong gods will come back in one form or another, and that if we get ahead of it, we can choose the better of the strong gods. The three bugbears of Reno's work are open-mindedness, open trade, and open borders. He says that all three of these things have gone way too far, and that people who find themselves without boundaries, without traditions, feel adrift, and that this leads to kind of a combination of hopelessness and also openness to things which are terrible. Reno really wants to revive patriotism and/or nationalism. He says today that these notions are normally just mocked or even condemned as being fascist in nature, but he thinks that nationalism and patriotism are actually mostly a very positive thing. He also wants to encourage greater civic participation. I put an asterisk next to this in my notes because he never quite defines what that would be. And at various times, he does express strong disapproval of certain kinds of civic participation, i.e. protest. But he wants to keep all of those things in check with religious faith and marriage. He says effectively that you can allow for the strong god of nationalism as long as you have religious faith and marriage as strong institutions to basically serve as moderating influences. People who are bound by a belief in God and happily married, or he doesn't actually say happily married, he just says married, will be prevented from turning to extreme ideologies. At various points, he also strongly advocates for having children and talks a little bit in the end about his Catholic faith. So, to give a quick take before I go into the strengths and weaknesses, I think I've said on this channel, or if I haven't, then certainly on my history channel, that if I really had to summarize Ron Paul's beliefs, I would say that his whole project is let's go back to 1928. Let's undo everything the New Deal accomplished and everything that's come since. Reno's project is similar, but goes back even deeper. Reno's project is to turn the clock back to 1913. He wants people to be more trusting and less skeptical. Much of his coverage of various intellectuals is more or less a condemnation of their efforts to dissect and critique society. Reno clearly prefers that people just accept things as they are, mind their own business, and engage within the confines and rules of their given profession, home church, or local community. He wants the kind of jolly patriotism and simple faith in the nation that the nations of Europe displayed during World War I before it became evident that the leaders had failed on a massive level and that even the generals at the front really didn't know precisely how to fight in this new era. So people were still signing up gleefully for a couple years into the war. He wants to get back to that. And frankly, I have no idea how you put the genie back in the bottle and get back to that point or why you'd ever want to, but we'll get to that later. But let's focus on the things that Reno, at least in my opinion, either gets right or at the very least makes an interesting point worthy of further thought. The greatest strengths of this work: Reno correctly identifies a long-standing tradition of intellectuals whose historical understanding is far too heavily based on a single aberrant period of history to the exclusion of other periods or the possibility of substantial change beyond the 1930s and 1940s. I have to emphasize that this is kind of my takeaway from this book. I don't think this is what Reno was intending, but effectively, we do have a lot of people in our political class who their one point of historical reference is the rise of Nazism in World War II. And then a lot of discussions on politics, when people are talking about the future, they seem to think that the only two directions we can go are fascist or not fascist, effectively. And it just makes me wonder why their frame of reference is so narrow. So that was one thing, at least I took away. But now to get the things that are more Reno. He points out that we need to move beyond our collective obsession with the politics of our grandfathers. While I don't agree with a lot of his solutions, as we'll get to, I think that he is right that we need to think beyond what happened in the 1930s and 40s. We're now in the 2020s. It's been 80 years. We have to confront the problems of our own time. Reno understands that much of today's unease stems from economic dislocation and or a stagnant or sliding standard of living, despite the fact that his primary focus is on vaguely defined cultural issues and the writings of intellectuals of whom he disapproves. So a lot of people who are obsessed with culture war stuff tend to be either ignorant or contemptful of material things. And while Reno doesn't focus on this heavily, at least he is aware of it. So he's got that going for him. Reno sees that both parties in America are part of the neoliberal consensus and that they are defending it tooth and nail against all challenges. I think that that's an important point that far too few people understand. A lot of people think that the problem lies with the party they don't belong to, that it's the other guys who are the bad guys. But in truth, both the Democrats and the Republicans have been on board with neoliberalism for decades, and that is why things are the way that they are, at least economically. One thing I liked about Reno's work is that, unlike a lot of right-wingers who are into cultural issues, he doesn't just rail against leftist thinkers, but he also includes people who are traditionally considered to be on the right, Hayek, Friedman, and Buckley, and he talks about why they fit in with what he's talking about, how they follow the general trend, and also his reasons for not liking what they say. At some points, he actually came close to trying to argue that Hayek and Friedman don't really count as conservatives because they're not tradcons, but I think he stopped himself because he realizes that when you have a watershed event like World War II, that really changes the dynamics of everything. So I think that he wisely backed off from a point that I'm about 95% sure he was dying to make, but didn't get around to making. When it comes to Friedman in particular, Reno actually makes a very trenchant observation. He points out how a great number of Friedman's proposals have been taken up by both parties over several decades, and how he remains a paramount influence. Whether that's direct or indirect, or whether people have been taking up Friedman knowingly or unknowingly, I can't say, but Reno does point out that everything from the UBI, which Andrew Yang made very prominent about a year ago, to trying to privatize Social Security, which was a project of Bush in 2005, which failed. All of these things, at least as policies, were things that Friedman talked about. Not to say that he was the only person talking about them, but he was one of the more famous people talking about them. And presumably at least some of the people who have taken up these issues in the years since have read or been influenced by his work in some way. Although he does not develop this idea, Reno has a point about how open trade has created anxiety and has killed jobs. Attached with this is that Reno never talks about the issue of wage depression, merely jobs going away. So he was close to possibly getting a point, and he's right about the perception that many people in the working class have about immigration. I just wish he had taken it a little further. He has mostly interesting, if obviously very narrow and skewed readings of some major modern thinkers. So I actually very much enjoyed his sections when he was looking at Popper and Derrida. I thought that his ideas there were interesting, even if I didn't agree with most of them. And one thing that I found admirable about the book is that in the afterword, he admits that his essay is not up to academic standards in terms of his citations, and that it should not be regarded as such. And I respect that because he is a THD, a Doctor of Theology, and he taught at Creighton University, or is it Creighton College, I'm not sure, for 20 years, before now going to work with the Edmund Burke Foundation, and pointing out effectively that he's not quite a scholar of this issue in particular, even though he does have the credentials that would suggest he might be. That is an ethical move, and one that sometimes I see people trying to skirt. So I do respect that he did that. And when I talk about people skirting it, I'll just go ahead and point out the person who does it the worst. Dr. Bill Warner, who has a PhD in electrical engineering or something like that, likes to call himself Dr. Bill Warner or Bill Warner PhD and then talk about Islam. Now, if you dig deep enough into his site, it will say what his degree is in, but on most of the pages it just says Bill Warner PhD. So I feel like, by comparison, Reno's approach was more honest and more ethical. Now to get to the highlights of where I think Reno is wrong and where his work is weak. One thing I noticed from the outset is that Reno is very imprecise with his terminology, and that he does not seem to have a precise knowledge of recent history. This is surprising to me, given that most people who study theology really get into studying text in depth and critiquing vocabulary and terminology heavily. So I figured that because he has a background in theology, that he would be very meticulous about the way that he employs his terminology, almost to the point of being pedantic, but it's actually the exact opposite. He uses terms such as post-war era and neoliberalism interchangeably, which I think is a problem, because the post-war era is not entirely neoliberal. Neoliberalism doesn't really begin until at the earliest 1976, more usually 1978, 1980, or if you want to wait for the Democrats to embrace it, 1992. So that is not the whole post-war era, and using these two terms interchangeably or saying that the post-war consensus and neoliberalism are the same is not accurate. I would say that the post-war era has a Keynesian phase and a neoliberal phase. There's not just a single post-war phase. We're talking about government policy, especially on economics and other things. If you're talking about foreign policy, you could make that case, but Reno doesn't talk about foreign policy at all. And he does acknowledge that his use of the terminology is loose. However, when he's anticipating objections, he says that the only thing that people might object to is the period before and after the Cold War. But again, neoliberalism came about before the end of the Cold War. And the Cold War itself, of course, is another breaking point, or I guess you could call it a break point in history. So you can see some changes in policy and attitudes after the Cold War, mostly intensifications of what had come before. And he doesn't quite acknowledge that. So I feel like even though he is interested in this period, he didn't do a lot of research in terms of trying to figure out even the periodization. As a writer, Reno was pretty average, possibly just a bit above average. I'm talking about just his prose. But the organization of this essay is poor, and he doesn't explicitly state his argument until about the very end of the 160 pages of main text. Now, because of what's written on the jacket, and because of the title and some other things, I pretty much knew what he was going to argue the whole way through, but he is very reticent to make his argument explicitly, and it takes a very long time to get there. We'll talk about also how, because he waits to the very end to make his argument, he tries to then glom on some stuff to it without really arguing for it or explaining it. One thing I found fascinating about this work is that Reno is adamantly opposed to open-mindedness. He always, when he mentions it, treats it with contempt, and he pays it not even a passing ounce of respect at any point. I can honestly say that I have never heard anyone bash the idea of open-mindedness. I have heard some people say that you shouldn't be so open-minded that your brain slides out, but most people are insistent that you should be open-minded to them at the least, or hear them out, even if they don't want you to be open-minded to someone else. Reno is against the open mind, and it's very clear, and he's more or less explicit about this. So I don't know whether I respect this or whether I find this horrifying. And I don't really see the problem with having an open mind. You would, if you say you were actually brainwashed or warped in the way that Reno seems to think that the liberal establishment is, you would need an open mind to take him seriously, wouldn't you? So why object to people having open minds? This makes no sense. And while it is more a matter of perspective than an outright flaw, one thing I found obnoxious about Reno, that I also find obnoxious about some other thinkers, both left and right, is that Reno seems to regard the writings of intellectuals such as Karl Popper and Jacques Derrida to be causal, in terms of really serving as guiding lights for the educated class. He thinks that people read their works and go out and make policy directly, and that there is a direct line between these things, and that our world on the streets has really been shaped by a couple of cloistered academics from mostly the 1950s in the case of Karl Popper. What this ignores is that theorists are far more often referenced than critically read, and that only a handful of people actually try to establish a firm, thorough grasp of their teachings. Even if we're talking about things being filtered down to a popular level, there aren't a lot of people out there clamoring for in-depth documentaries about the influence of Karl Popper. Reno also assumes that people are implementing deconstructionism just because sometimes college students write papers on imperialism as a theme in a classical text. So if someone looks at Tacitus's histories and they write about imperialism as a theme in that work, he thinks that they're over-modernizing it because imperialism is a modern concept and that they're not reading it correctly. We'll come back to that later. And he thinks that this is deconstructionism in action, and this is having some huge impact in how we lead our lives, and it's taking away truth. I don't think that's what most people are doing. Another major issue with this sort of intellectual causation scheme is that it assumes that many of the leading power brokers, including most of the political and virtually all of the business class, have actually read these authors and care what they think. Most people in American politics and in American business are not very intellectual. They don't give a shit about critical theory. If they can cite it at all, they're doing it from Cliff's Notes. And if you press them in the slightest, they will fold like a house of cards or start bluffing like motherfuckers. Because they don't read this. That's not what they do. These are type A people. They don't have the attention span to read complex theory. And frankly, they also lack the intellectual depth to do so, even if they were so inclined. Although he is right to an extent that all of the post-war thinkers, or at least most of the major ones, are against blind obedience, he does very much obscure and downplay the huge differences between all of the post-war thinkers. The differences between, say, Hayek and Buckley and von Mises and Friedman on the one hand, and then people on the left like Derrida and Foucault on the other is obvious enough. But even between people such as Derrida and Foucault, there are important differences. They're living in somewhat different periods. They have different concerns. Some of them are more active politically than others. Some of them see themselves as purely academic. It's just a huge, broad labeling scheme that I find kind of laughable as an approach the more I think about it, now that I'm a few days removed from finishing the book. And what it really reminds me of is how you have libertarians and anarchists who label all of their various detractors as, quote, statist, as if this category means anything. It's a category which excludes basically no one. So it might as well just be people who study politics. And then the people who don't believe in the state are just a tiny minority outside of that in some way. I don't know. It's a dumb category. It makes no sense. And in terms of trying to brigade or categorize things, it really doesn't work very well. Another major weakness of Reno's work is that although he states repeatedly that open borders are an essential component of the entire post-war consensus for the whole West, Reno cannot be bothered to produce any examples of actual open border policies. Where are the open borders at? Which country? He never says. He just says there are open borders. Citation needed. He just states that all Western countries have had open borders since 1945, and that the reason is cultural, that the leaders who are trying to maintain open minds and an open culture are hoping that immigrants will come in and water down native cultures so that the strong gods won't return. I'm sure that that's really what the motive was. Open borders, as presented by Reno, is simply a right-wing straw man. It's not really a policy. Now, there are some people who believe in open borders, but they have not, to this point, ever been in power. Or if they have been in power, they've not been able to implement their policy. Such a policy has created lots and lots of backlash, even when it's just an accusation. Or even when immigration levels are higher than some people are comfortable with, especially if there's any kind of economic turmoil. He also ignores that a lot of the high-level support for large-scale immigration has nothing to do with cultural reasons, and a lot more to do with trying to get people in the countries to work for less. Germany, for instance, encourages Turkish immigration because they can pay Turkish people less money. The US does the same thing with people from Mexico and the rest of Latin America. It's not because of some concern that if we don't let in enough diverse people, we'll turn Nazi. I find it bizarre at best that an academic scholar is arguing explicitly against critical readings of text and is in favor of teaching college students to read with an eye toward truth and beauty. Usually truth and beauty is sort of a straw man that historians like myself use to make fun of people in classics. Now, there are some classics people who are all about the truth and beauty, and they will interrupt class to talk about how they think an ablative absolute used by Cicero in line 8 is the height of beauty and elegance. Those people exist, these kind of ascetic, weird wackos. But what Reno's arguing for here is literally that. He wants college education to be that. Given how many conservatives bitch and moan about how unfair and biased professors are, it seems very hypocritical to me to want professors to grade students by how well they catch on to and cater to a professor's aesthetic preferences, because that's what a truth and beauty curriculum would look like. I mean, there are some professors in classics who already kind of do that a little bit. I had one professor who, if you made a major grammatical mistake, such as completely misidentifying a word or a part of speech, you lost the same amount of points as if you choose a potential translation that he doesn't think is the most elegant. So, the truth and beauty thing is already a problem, and we need to move as far the fuck away from that as we possibly can, not toward it. And also, how do you define truth and beauty? And what's the point of continuing to study things if you never produce new insights, but instead just teach standard translations and just, not translations, but interpretations, and just have people learn the same exact thing slavishly by rote memory generation after generation? I don't see the point. This is dumb. Critical engagement is what we need to find problems and come up with solutions to those problems. We have to be creative on some level, even when we're trying to acquire erudition. We have to figure out how to use logic, how to use evidence, how to construct arguments. It's not just let's memorize things and learn what R.R. Reno thinks is true and beautiful. Truth and beauty is useful only if you want pithy, learned references on hand and nothing else. Or you just want to be able to talk knowingly with other people who went to the same college about how the soul charioteer in Plato's Symposium is a profound metaphor and how it speaks to the depths of your soul. Reno tried to argue that we should emulate the critical approach of Plato and the Old Testament, an actual quote from page 159. Here is that statement in full. But this is not the critical sensibility of Plato's dialogues or the Old Testament prophets. In its classical mode, critical thinking goes up. It disenchants the half-truths of conventional wisdom so that a fuller truth can shine forth. It exposes contradictions and smashes idols so that we can look upwards with fresh eyes. It seeks a strengthening of being, not its weakening. If we are to meet the challenges of the 21st century, we must recover this kind of critical reason. There are lots of problems with this passage. The most obvious of which is that Plato and the Old Testament are extremely different on every conceivable level. Plato's dialogues lay out criticisms of positions and include arguments. You can read Plato and learn why he thinks what he thinks. It is critical in a way, and Plato also gives enough credibility, at least typically, to the positions he's arguing against, that there is some framework in place which should help the reader figure out his own or her own thoughts about the issue in question. The point is to allow for further discussion. And while Plato has an argument he prefers and that he makes stronger, he at least gives a somewhat credible version of the opposing viewpoint. He doesn't try to smear them too badly, and sometimes those guys will even get in a few points, and certainly they will maintain some semblance of dignity. The Old Testament is fundamentally different and not critical at all. It merely makes claims and demands obedience with no critical thought required, unless you count prophets occasionally bemoaning the state of the world or pointing out how some king or other is out of line with God's will. But the prophets are not there to debate you. They're not there to engage critically. They're there to simply make pronouncements. That's it. They're there to simply tell you things and either be obeyed or not. That's the be-all and end-all of how the Old Testament works. To conflate Plato and the Old Testament is absurd, since the two works are radically different in terms of the purposes that they're designed to serve, and frankly, those purposes are so fundamentally incompatible that to list them together as a pair strikes me as a rather pathetic attempt to try to claim the authority of the, quote, Western tradition, and to try to impress less learned readers by sort of gish-galloping over the deep, vast differences between how Plato and how the Old Testament, quote, critiques things. Plato's critique method is still viable, I think, but the Old Testament only works if you believe you already have the truth established and that there's some authority on high who can simply hand it down from the mountain in the most literal sense. Reno also has an obsession with an ill-defined solidarity. He never quite gets around to defining what solidarity is, how we lack it, and what it would look like if we got it back, or what it looked like in the past. The implication is that solidarity is some bonding factor which brings all of us together as Americans, or as a whole. When he does kind of talk about this, and as I said, organizationally, Reno's work is very weak. Sometimes he'll talk about 2 or 3 different topics in a paragraph, and only have a sentence on each one, so it does tend to skip a lot. When he does give examples, he is against solidarity built around grievances. He makes that clear. He is pretty disdainful of identity politics, which I get. But one thing I've noticed is that he is very selective in what kind of identity politics he's against. So, for instance, if he talks about gay people getting together, claiming oppression and building community around that, he says, that is an illegitimate way to build a community. That's not viable. However, if you build solidarity around a church group, even though most of these groups are also small and claim to be oppressed or aggrieved in some way by the larger society, that's fine. That's cool. Just don't be gay. And beyond being gay, though, one thing that Reno really hates with an obvious passion are transgendered people. And this was one of the first things that struck me, because anytime he needs an example of something that's terrible or that shows the modern world is out of whack, he will talk about transgendered people or transgendered rights or some other thing along those lines. He seems to believe that our society must choose to allow for transgender rights on the one hand or uphold the institution of marriage on the other. And I'm not sure how he came to that conclusion. He never explains it, but at various times he juxtaposes these two things enough that you can see that in his mind it's a one thing or the other proposition, and there's only room enough for one winner. You cannot have transgendered rights and the institution of marriage, for whatever reason. Not only is this a false dichotomy, but it makes no sense on any level, and Reno neither defends nor explains the position. He just uses the Old Testament version of critical engagement and just basically fucking says it. So you would think if this is something that's near and dear to his heart, as it obviously is since he has it in his book on several occasions, he might bother to spell this out at some point, but he passes on that opportunity. Now, if his opposition were to gay marriage instead of transgendered rights, then I would at least understand the correlation between gay marriage and straight marriage, although we've had gay marriage for several years now and there are still straight married couples. But still, I at least get the direct relationship between these two things as institutions. So I really have no idea what he's getting at. I assume it's just that he was one of those guys who was adamantly against gay marriage, but he gave up. And now he thinks that transgendered rights is the most winnable fight that the right has culturally. So he's trying to put all his eggs in that basket, even though recent history shows that right-wing positions on social issues eventually lose out with the public. So he's setting himself up for failure, and I really hope that if and when he goes on camera and bemoans his defeat, that someone sends me the link, because I really want to see him cry. Reno's understanding of psychology is incredibly piss poor. He thinks that therapy and individual striving are largely nonsensical. He also mocks any kind of therapeutic approaches to politics, i.e. trying to make people feel more comfortable. And he thinks that this is a misapplication of modern psychology, and then he kind of also implies that modern psychology is a bunch of bullshit. Now, he doesn't offer an alternative to that, which I would be open to if he could actually come up with a viable alternative, but he doesn't. He also seems to lack any real appreciation of, for lack of a better term, how people work. He doesn't get that people are wired differently, that some people think, feel, and live differently because they have their own imperatives. That some people are not 9-to-5ers, that some people aren't really suited for marriage, that some people aren't suited for desk jobs or what have you. He is very much of the belief that everyone has the same path. He says that the way to find happiness and to live a productive life, the right way to live, you grow up, you go to college, you get a job, you get married, you start a family, you retire, then you die. And along the way, you focus on all the steps involved. And if you focus on those steps, you will remain happy and content, and you won't be out in the streets protesting or causing problems. And he thinks that this is just an obvious truth, and that if everybody just did this, everyone would be happy, everything would be great. I really have no idea how he gets off thinking that. The man is probably at least 50 years old. He's met different people. He's been around academics. He's been around some fairly eccentric people. I don't know how he comes away with this idea that everyone can just live the same way and they will all be happy and content. That's just not true. It's never been true. We have no evidence that there was ever this period of sublime happiness in human history where everyone just adhered to the basic dominant culture and everyone fit within it like a glove. And effectively, at one point, he also says that people should look to standards such as gender standards and try to adhere to them as much as possible and really focus on adhering to these things tightly and neatly. Again, kind of too late for that. And in many ways, if you look at both his life advice and his obsession with maintaining gender roles and sticking with marriages, even ones that are failed, because he says that we need to revisit the issue of no-fault divorces, i.e. people need to stick it the hell out, regardless of circumstances. What he's effectively advocating is a return to the 50s, where the only way out of a bad marriage was arsenic. And when people who were homosexuals and should not have been marrying other people of the opposite gender were deeply unhappy, they should just suck it up. They should just keep their nose to the grindstone. I don't know if that would be a metaphor or not. That would make sense. But anyway, they should just suck it up. Oh, God. Lesbians should just suck it up. Basically. Okay, so final point here. The basic argument that he makes, and again, this only comes within the last page or so, is that we need to bring back nationalism with strong patriotism, and that this can be effectively and completely mitigated, at least all the negative parts can be magically mitigated, by the twin forces of the institution of marriage and religion, specifically religious belief, faith. And that then nationalism with those two things in tow will be a force for positive good and immune to fascism. There's no way we can go fascist if people get married and they have religious faith and they love gender roles. This is fucking stupid. This is insane. This is insipid. I can't believe this man has the equivalent of a PhD. This guy's a fucking idiot. This is dumb as fuck. He's just a religious zealot eager to force Jesus into the equation, even though he adds this at the very last minute and makes zero effort to make the argument work or make sense. Now, before he mentioned faith on occasion, but it was not a major theme. And then at the end, he just globs it on. He just throws it in. Oh yeah, and everybody needs to believe in God again. If that is an important part of having strong nationalism without fascism, you might want to talk about that more. You might not want to wait until the end and just claim it. And it's interesting because in his afterword, where he talks about it not being an academic work, he also says that his readers and his friends told him that the last chapter was not as strong as the others. No fucking shit. Good God. The argument is awful. This is pathetic. This is a meme. Also, I know that he thinks that the threat of fascism has lifted, but if we want to talk about that period, one thing that's interesting is that Christianity in the 30s and 40s, while not at its historical strongest point, certainly stronger than it is today. And also, marriage rates were way higher than they are today. Yet, they did not prevent a zealous nationalistic bloodbath in World War I, where people rallied behind their flags and butchered each other with walls of lead and mustard gas and everything else. Nor did marriage and Jesus prevent the rise of fascism, including the rise of Hitler. It's also worth noting that although famously many of Hitler's generals were not outright Nazis, they were merely Nazi enablers, pretty much all of his generals that I've studied, and the videos of them with Sean looking at various generals, all of these guys, pretty much all of them, were both married, usually with children, and had Christian faith, or at least a Christian upbringing. So, what was the problem? Himmler was raised Christian, and his parents were married, and then he grew up to become a semi-pagan bureaucrat of doom. So what went wrong? Why didn't these magical institutions hold back Heinrich Himmler? Why didn't they hold back Hitler? Why didn't they hold back all of the generals who claimed that they knew better but led his armies anyway? It's almost as if this idea that getting married and believing in Jesus will prevent anything from getting out of hand and only produce moderate outcomes is laughably ahistorical and disproven from the moment that it leaves one's lips. Yeah. So anyway, that's all I have here. I honestly feel dumber for having to discuss this book. And if you're wondering why I rarely discuss right-wing thinkers, quote-unquote, now you know. It's because they produce bullshit like this. So stop asking me to look at more of them. I've done my duty for the year 2020. And for the rest of this year, I shall read no more right-wing books. I'm Spirit of Thersites. Peace out. Remember to subscribe, like, comment, ring the bell. Go to my other channels, WTF Gas Podcast and Thersites the Historian. Do all the same shit there. Peace out.